Hey guys, welcome back. We are going to look at part 2 of the Cold War from 1945 to 1980. As I said in the last video, that is a huge chunk of time and such a big topic to cover in just one topic from the APUSH curriculum that we are really going to be content heavy in this video. There's a lot of stuff going on in here. I've tried to pare it down as much as I can, but there are just so many important events that occur in the Cold War from this time. So let's pick up with the topic we were just about to talk about in the last video, and that is the Korean War, something that you definitely remember learning about in world history. Now, the Korean War, guys, is a great example of taking the containment policy, the Truman Doctrine, in other words, and putting it into action, because we had to contain the spread of communism around the globe, and that would bring our attention rather to Korea. A little bit of context here. So the Korean Peninsula had been part of the Japanese Empire, and then when Japan lost World War II, of course, the peninsula is going to be divided along the 38th parallel. Basically, there's an American-friendly government down here in South Korea, and a Soviet-friendly government up here in North Korea. So communist and not communist Korean Peninsula. And of course, in present day, it's basically the same thing. On June 25th, 1950, the communist Korea, North Korea in other words, with Soviet support, invaded South Korea. The goal here is to unify the entire peninsula under communism. Stalin and North Korea were gambling that America would not be willing to sacrifice blood and treasure to defend South Korea so soon after World War II, that we would not be ready for yet another war. And frankly, there probably was some truth in that. Not many Americans knew even the first thing about Korea. Probably couldn't even find it on a map. And so would they be really willing to fight and die for this place? Well, if you recall, Truman's policy of containment said we have to stop the spread of communism. Well, in the case of Korea, this is going to be more than just sending over dollars. This is literally having to go to war. And Truman knew that if he gave in on the Korea issue, then the Soviets would try somewhere else next. And then they would just push us, and eventually containment would even be a thing because the Soviet Union would be going wherever they wanted to. So we had to step up and stop their aggression. The famous World War II General Douglas MacArthur is given command of UN forces because this war is going to be a war fought under the jurisdiction of the United Nations. And so it's going to be American soldiers primarily, but you also have Canadians and British soldiers, Turkish soldiers. There's a whole crew that will be going to South Korea to help defend South Korea, alongside, of course, the South Koreans themselves. Of note, this is the first war America fought, basically since the Revolution, in which the Army was desegregated. Desegregation is something we're going to talk about as we get into civil rights later in this period. But that, again, this is the first war we fought with a desegregated U.S. military. Okay, so what's going on in the war? Well, the North Korean advance into South Korea had been very, very successful. In fact, they had pushed us all the way down to right around Pusan. And then Douglas MacArthur takes an army, lands them at Incheon back here. And at the same time, we counterattack from Pusan, and the North Korean army found itself trapped. And they fall apart, and they start retreating just as fast as they possibly could to the north. The UN says that, yes, you can go past the 38th parallel, so now the UN is basically sanctioning an invasion of North Korea. Remember, the purpose of this war had been to stop North Korean invasion into South Korea. Now we're invading North Korea, and this is where things are going to get a little dicey. And the reason it's getting dicey is by this point in world history, North Korea has two communist northern neighbors, the Soviet Union, you see a little bit of Soviet Union there, and of course China. And every mile we push closer to China in particular, the more nervous the Chinese communists get. And the Chinese basically say, don't come up here. We don't want you here. Douglas MacArthur is under the assumption, and you might even say delusion, that the Chinese are bluffing, that they're no threat. He assures President Truman that the Chinese will not get involved in this war. And we keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing closer to the Yalu River. And then in November 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops invade North Korea and push the UN forces back down the 38th parallel, back down below the 38th parallel. And this was a humiliating retreat. It was something Americans were not used to. You know, Americans don't really retreat that much in war. We are always on the attack. And this was embarrassing, and it also is going to cost MacArthur his job. MacArthur is going to lose his job not just because of the retreat, but also because he had been pretty openly urging nuclear strikes on China, which of course would have brought the Soviet Union in, would have caused World War III, in other words. And he had also been criticizing, again, pretty openly, President Truman, his boss, right? The president is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, and eventually Truman has had enough, and he fires General MacArthur. Now, what happens next in the Korean War? Well, after the Chinese invasion, the Chinese are able to push us back down to about the 38th parallel, and there the war begins to kind of grind to a halt. It becomes something almost like World War I, where there's trench warfare and not a lot of progress, but certainly a lot of people dying. It becomes a quagmire, okay? It becomes quicksand. It becomes unpopular back in America. Why are we still in Korea? What are we doing there? And in 1952, there's a presidential election, and the Republican nominee, Dwight D. Eisenhower, hero of World War II, before he is elected, he makes a campaign pledge to go to Korea and help end the war. Now, he does, in fact, go to Korea, but that doesn't end the war. The war doesn't actually come to an end until July 1953, and that is when UN forces in North Korea agree to a ceasefire, an armistice, in other words. However, what they did not agree to is a permanent peace treaty. A permanent peace treaty, as of 2021, when I'm recording this, has not yet been signed. So on a very technical level, the Korean War is still ongoing, but the sides just haven't been fighting since 1953. So all told, about 36,000 Americans are going to die in the Korean War, and as I mentioned a moment ago, the peninsula still remains divided and still remains tense. There are a number of parallels between the Korean War and the Vietnam War we're going to look at a little bit later in this unit. The fact that the war becomes, well, let me back up. The fact that both wars began with a fair amount of enthusiasm, and we felt we were justified in getting in these wars, but the longer each war went on, the less and less popular it got, and people started to question, what are we doing in Korea? What are we doing in Vietnam? And even declaring victory or not is also something the two wars have in common. Was the Korean War a victory? Well, we can say it's a victory because we stopped North Korea from taking over South Korea, right? But we didn't eliminate the threat. The threat is still there today. So it leaves a very it left us very uncomfortable. You know, this was not World War II where the troops come home to big parades. There wasn't a really satisfying conclusion, and that is something Americans don't like. All right, now let's go back to Europe and look at open skies. So President Eisenhower was a guy who wanted to bring down military spending, and the way he was going to do this was cut back on more traditional conventional forces like the Army and the Navy and spend much more on the Air Force and what's known as the Strategic Air Command. And Strategic Air Command, or SAC for short, was basically this bomber fleet that would drop nuclear bombs on their targets. Obviously, the Soviet Union would probably be the primary target. And in theory, this would save money and also pressure the Soviet Union into obeying. That's kind of the thought behind this. And so we build lots of these long-range bombers and lots of nuclear weapons, and that's going to be our new policy. If you're an airplane geek like myself, you would know this is a B-36 bomber. This thing is an absolute monster of a plane. In fact, let me show you what I mean by that. This is a B-29. This is the type of bomber that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? That's a big plane in its own right. This is the B-36. Look at the size of this thing. I mean, that is one of the wheels of the landing gear. All right, now, Dwight D. Eisenhower is negotiating with Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, over this Open Skies program. And what Open Skies meant was America would be allowed to fly over the Soviet Union, the Soviets would be able to fly over America, and we could then sort of see what each other's doing, and we would be less paranoid, less fearful, and less likely to go to war. And Nikita Khrushchev turns us down. He's like, no, you can't fly over the Soviet Union. That's not going to happen. And so we're going to respect this decision. Or actually, we're not going to respect the decision at all. Instead, what we do is we just start flying over the Soviet Union illegally. And we thought we could get away with this because the spy plane that was being used, it's called the U-2 spy plane, could fly, basically twice as high as any other airplane. I mean, this thing is up like 60, 70,000 feet in the air. It's the guys who fly this thing are wearing like a spacesuit. It's so far up there in the atmosphere. And we thought it was out of range of Soviet anti-aircraft missiles. And it was for a while. The Soviets could see our planes flying over them. They'd shoot their missile and nothing would happen because we were flying too high. And this is something the Soviets couldn't admit publicly because then they'd look weak. So they're just kind of, stomping their feet and developing more longer range missiles. And then in 1960, in what was going to be one of the last flights over the Soviet Union, the Soviets finally get lucky, and one of their missiles, in fact, does take down one of our spy planes flown by this guy here, Francis Gary Powers, or Gary Powers, he's usually better known as. At first, we denied that we had been flying over the Soviet Union. We denied it was a spy plane. But little did we know that the Soviets, in fact, had the wreckage and had the pilot because he had bailed out and was rescued and now was prisoner. And the Soviets were going to put him on trial. This was hugely embarrassing for the United States. And we eventually had to do kind of a swap where we give them back some of their spies and they give us back Gary Powers. And it was an embarrassment, to say the least, because remember, America has always, but especially in the Cold War, portrayed itself as the rule follower, as the good guy who doesn't do these, underhanded tricks like the Soviet Union. And here we got caught doing something we were not supposed to be doing. And this only leads to increased tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. All right, let's look at the so-called kitchen debate. So in 1959, our vice president at the time, you can see him right here, Richard Milhous Nixon, he goes over to Moscow. And there's this big exhibition, and in this exhibition, the Americans had built a sort of a replica of like an average American home, and it was chock full of all the things, all the appliances an average American home had, things like a washing machine, a dishwasher, and all that kind of stuff. And as they were touring this exhibition, they paused at the American house, and Khrushchev, again, that's Stalin's successor, and Nixon have this sort of impromptu debate on the merits of communism versus capitalism. And Khrushchev was frankly a bit of a bully. He was not like Stalin. I mean, he was certainly just as dangerous as Stalin, but he was a little bit more gregarious and open than Stalin was, and he liked to push people and see how far he could get with them. And Nixon gets a lot of praise for standing up to Khrushchev and defending American values and capitalism and democracy and all this kind of stuff. And it got Nixon a lot of brownie points back here in America. All right, now let's move on and talk about the space race, one of my favorite topics in world history, because I love space and I love history, and well, there you go. 1957 was the year, guys, and the Soviets did something that nobody had ever done before. They put an artificial satellite into orbit. It was called Sputnik, and Sputnik changed everything. Now, not that Sputnik did a whole lot. It was about the size of a basketball, and it just made a beeping noise, basically. But the fact that the Soviets could put something into orbit really, really freaked us out, because if they could put a satellite into orbit, or they could later launch a dog into space, like, could they also put nuclear missiles on there? Could they put satellites over us to spy on us? Like, we were really freaking out about this. Laika, by the way, the first living thing to go into space, she did not make it very long. This was a one-way trip. And so Laika, first living thing, and also the first living thing to die in space. So as I said, this freaks us out, shakes our self-confidence. You know, we were the country that had developed nuclear weapons. We're developing primitive computers and things by 1957. And for us to be beaten by the Soviets just really rubbed us wrong. And so a new organization called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, is established to respond to the Soviets and get us back in the lead. This also changes schooling. So the theory went that the reason we were behind the Soviets in science and math is because our schools were too soft, that we were giving kids too much recess time, too much finger painting, too much, fun little stories, and not enough hard math, hard science, not enough engineering. And we need to toughen up these schools, and we need to refocus our schools to catch up with the Soviets. All right, so JFK, which is, of course, Eisenhower's successor, took the space race and turned it into something different. It's not a matter of just catching up with the Soviets. We were going to beat the Soviets. We're going to beat them to the moon. And he gives this famous speech in which he said basically by the end of the decade, that's the 1960s, we would go to the moon and return safely. And so we would. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin make history as they landed on the moon, and we had won this space race. This was just a huge, huge accomplishment, and it's something that I think even today inspires people to think about challenges and how to overcome those challenges. All right, last big topic, guys, is détente. So there's President Nixon, and there's Leonid Brezhnev, who was Khrushchev's successor as leader of the Soviet Union. So in 1972, Nixon goes to China. And this was a big deal because China was a communist dictatorship under Mao Zedong. It was a country that we had fought against in the Korean War back in the 1950s. And Nixon had a reputation of being very anti-communist. Okay, we're going to talk about the Red Scare in a later video, but Nixon really had kind of made his political life by becoming a red hunter and going after suspected communists, being very tough on communism and that sort of thing. And for him to go to China and shake hands with Mao Zedong and normalize a relationship with China was an enormous step, because what it did is it really helped to thaw some of the Cold War, at least between us and the Chinese anyways. Nixon is not only looking to get friendly with the Chinese just to, for PR purposes, also this will strike a blow against the Soviets, because the Soviets and the Chinese were becoming communist rivals of each other, and Nixon hoped that by being friendly with China, then this would take one enemy off the chess table, and in fact, maybe even help us create a new, ally is probably too strong of a word, but at least a country that would be a little friendlier to our anti-Soviet policies. There is Nixon visiting China and checking out the local food, although he looks very suspicious of it. In 1972, he also travels to Moscow. And there he agrees to sell grain to the Soviets. And we're not going to get too much into that, other than to say that the Soviet economy, which had really grown pretty well in the 50s and 60s, really began to slow down and contract in the 1970s. So much so that the Soviets were having trouble feeding themselves. And so we agreed to sell grain to the Soviets. And this agreement between the two Cold War enemies ushers in this new moment known as détente. Détente is French for relaxation, and it refers to this idea of relaxing the tensions, calming things down between us and the Soviets. And in the spirit of this, several treaties were signed to reduce the likelihood of the Cold War becoming a hot war, of becoming a nuclear war. Things like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was signed between us and the Soviets, and the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Both of these involving missiles and nuclear weapons and just trying to calm things down, making the arms race a little less hectic, and in fact trying to end the arms race. Détente, though, will come to an end in 1979, and the reason it's going to come to an end is the Soviets in that year invade Afghanistan. And the reason they're invading Afghanistan, two reasons. One, it's one of their neighbors. Okay, there's the Soviet Union up here, there's Afghanistan. Reason number two, there had been a communist government that had been established in Afghanistan, and it was really in danger of collapsing from rebellion, and so the Soviets are going to send their soldiers in to prop up that government, which sounds kind of a lot like what America was doing in the Vietnam War, right? We were sending soldiers in to prop up the unpopular South Korean government, and the Soviets are going to fall into that same trap in the late 1970s. To protest this invasion, our president at the time, Jimmy Carter, orders an embargo, so we're going to stop selling stuff to them, stop buying stuff from them. We also boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. So we refused to send our athletes to the Olympics that were being held in Moscow that year. By the way, in 1984, the Soviets responded by refusing to come to our Olympics in 1984, which are being held in Los Angeles. All right, so that, guys, is it. I know that was a really long video, but there was just so much to go through when it comes to the Cold War. And hopefully in our next couple of videos we can slow down a little bit and cover a little bit less ground in one video, because that was a lot. Alright, that's it for the Cold War, guys. We're not totally done with it, obviously, because we'll talk about some of the ends of the Cold War later, but that's a good chunk of it done right now.